Hello and welcome back to another video. My name is CJ, the Populist New Yorker, and today we're going to be taking a look at a race that isn't getting a whole lot of attention this cycle, and that is the 2021 New York City mayoral election. So this race has really gone under the radar, with the gubernatorial races in Virginia and New Jersey really taking the forefront this year, and I think they really should. Although it is interesting to note that New York City itself almost has, is comparable in population to the entire state of New Jersey. And New York City is the largest city in America. So I think it makes sense that, this race does get some attention. But, as we all know, New York City is a very, very Democratic city. So that's probably one of the main reasons nobody's really talking about this race. But I wanted to go into, the details of this race and see if there's a little bit more there than, what we think on the surface. And something I really find interesting about this race is that there's not a single general election poll for the 2020 election. If we go back to 2017, even, there were general election polls between de Blasio and the Republican nominee. And we're not really seeing the same thing this cycle. And I think that is a little curious. I mean, I know New York City is a safe Democratic city. Obviously, they've had Republican mayors in the past, as recently as 2014 with Michael Bloomberg, who was a Republican who ran as an independent. But New York City is very interesting because it is not a monolith by any means. And that's one of the reasons why I really wanted to talk about it. Because unlike other cities, politically speaking, like Seattle or Portland, where, you've got basically every precinct is deep blue, that is by no means the case in New York City. So I want to take a look at a few of the past elections in New York City and really determine, what are the odds that this race could be relatively competitive. Now, I'm not really entertaining the idea that, there's a Republican upset. That's probably a 1 to 1,000 chance, just realistically speaking, based on the partisan breakdown of the country, New York City's political demography, and, the national environment. We're not really in an environment where, blue areas are electing Republicans and vice versa. It doesn't really happen. Elections are a lot more nationalized. And as a result, in other areas where, maybe they'd vote for a liberal Republican or a conservative Democrat, it doesn't really happen so much anymore. So if we go back to the 2016 election, we could take a look at the 5 boroughs that make up New York City. Of course, you have the Bronx, which is heavily Democratic, Manhattan, heavily Democratic, Queens, less Democratic, but still very, very Democratic, Brooklyn, and Staten Island, which is really the only red borough in New York City. The rest of New York City is, going blue by over 50 points. And in statewide races, sometimes Republicans can get maybe 30% in Queens if they're really lucky. But ultimately, all of these other boroughs outvote Staten Island by a gigantic amount. And as a result, you have Democrats, running away with 70-80% of the vote citywide. Manhattan is definitely, the Bronx is the most liberal or Democratic, but Manhattan is certainly the most liberal borough in terms of political affiliation. Now, if we go to the 2017 mayoral race, something you'll notice right away is that basically nobody votes in the New York City mayoral elections because it's basically a foregone conclusion that the Democrat is going to win. De Blasio was not a popular mayor, very unpopular among Republicans and independents, probably held his own with Democratic voters. Even now, I think his approval rating is in the 40s, which isn't too great in a city that votes for Democrats 70-80%. But, is certainly manageable considering, if you're in New York City, basically, if you're a Democrat, you're probably going to win the race from here on out. So in this last election, there was a decent third-party presence. The third party is making up, 5-6% of the vote. Interestingly enough, de Blasio only got 61% of the vote in Queens. And if we look at the New York mayoral elections historically, what you'll notice in, 2013, where de Blasio did very well. Of course, he did a lot worse comparably in 2013. But if we go back, Queens is a borough that can vote for Republicans on the mayoral side as recently as 2009. Again, back in 2009, he was an independent, but he was basically a Republican. We go back to 2005, even Brooklyn voting for Michael Bloomberg. Now, of course, Michael Bloomberg is a liberal Republican. He is a, moderate liberal Republican. But even so, that's extremely impressive in a city like New York City. And again, that was off of Giuliani as well. So in fact, if you go back to the last 20 years, New York City has been under control by Republicans / independents more so than it has been by Democrats. So now we go into the 2021 mayoral election. There's absolutely zero general election polling. Now, across the nation, as we've been seeing, Republicans are very energized to get out and vote, in places like Virginia where the polling has gotten really, really tight, and we'll, of course, make more videos on that, and New Jersey as well. The polls have been getting narrower. So I really think it's interesting that we have zero general election polls because, maybe Curtis Sliwa is at, the 30s or something like that. I have no idea actually where he stands in the general election polls because we don't have any. So it really is kind of interesting. Now, I certainly think out of all the Republican nominees, he's probably the best. He has broader appeal. He's a much more liberal Republican when it comes to policy. He's not really a social conservative. He's a law and order type guy, but so is Eric Adams, when compared to other members of the Democratic Party. So this really was, in the Democratic primary, as we saw, this really was about, who was going to solve New York City's crime wave, which was one of the biggest issues of the entire election. It wasn't COVID. It wasn't even jobs. It was really crime. And, Eric Adams eventually came out on top against Catherine Garcia, who was the progressive candidate. Well, one of a few. But, with the ranked choice voting system, it took a few days for us to actually get the numbers to find out who won the primary. And I mean, just to look at how, Democrats have such an advantage in the city of New York City. When you add up these two numbers, you're talking about nearly 800,000 ballots cast for the Democrats, when in the Republican primary, you have 60,000. So that's an astronomical difference. So it makes sense that, I guess, this is a safe Democratic seat. But something you're noticing across the country, and I think it's very possible that, if we go back to 2017, I could certainly see a situation where Curtis Sliwa probably gets somewhere in the 30s, maybe even 35%, something like that, which I think would be really impressive for a Republican. Do I think he's going to win? I don't. I don't even think it'll be close just because it's New York City. And a lot of things have changed. Obviously, Biden's at a low point in his presidency. National Democrats are at a low point. Republicans are as energized as ever, particularly in New York City. But Republicans just don't have the numbers in the city, not even close. So even with all that energy and lower turnout among Democrats, Democrats are still going to prevail in this election. This is the 2020 presidential election results in New York City. And something you could notice, every single borough except Staten Island trends more toward the Republicans. It would be pretty interesting to see this trend play out again in 2021, and I think it's very likely to, just because this is a citywide election. Curtis Sliwa is not Donald Trump. So I think that'll really help him in this mayoral election. Again, this Nicole Maliotakis, who is a congresswoman now from Staten Island, she was able to get nearly 27%. I think Sliwa is going to outperform that probably considerably by New York standards, probably get in the mid-30s. I'd be really surprised if he got into the high 30s, honestly. But, again, this is New York City. This is a super, super blue city. But New York City has elected moderate to more liberal Republicans in the past, as we've seen with Giuliani, as we've seen with Michael Bloomberg. So it's not out of the realm of possibility. We'll go to that in a second. But it's not impossible for a Republican to become mayor of New York City, especially somebody like Curtis Sliwa. Obviously, right now, I put it at a less than 1% chance just because of the partisan dynamic in the country. Obviously, maybe if circumstances were different nationally, somebody like Curtis Sliwa, a member of the Guardian Angels, would probably have a decent chance. But Eric Adams has also been entrenched in the community for a long time. He's a over 20-year NYPD veteran. So these are both people that are, well-known household names in New York City. So it certainly remains to be seen where New York trends in this mayoral election. If we take a look at a precinct map from the 2020 presidential election, as I was talking about before, New York City is not a monolith. If we just go real quick to, like I was talking about before, if we take a look at the city of Seattle, all deep blue in the presidential election. We could take a look at the city of Portland as well, all deep blue. You don't really have Republican neighborhoods, but that is not the case in New York City. New York City is diverse both ethnically and politically to an extent. You have, very Republican neighborhoods, Orthodox Jewish neighborhoods, Italian neighborhoods in southern Staten Island. You have upper middle class, wealthy beach communities that are voting Republican. And New York City really isn't, a monolith. And, it really all depends on turnout as well. Because as I said before, almost nobody voted in the 2017 mayoral election. The turnout was 25%, and that was up from just 13% in the 2013 election. 13% of voters in New York City, or 13% of adults maybe, per population. So nobody's voting in these races. So it really remains to be seen what the margin of victory will be for Adams. I think Adams is going to win. I think Curtis Sliwa is probably the best candidate the Republicans could have nominated, but I just don't think in today's partisan political environment that he's going to pull off a victory, especially since Eric Adams probably has strong support in Brooklyn. And, obviously Sliwa's got, appeal among Republicans and even independents, but I think the Democratic vote at the end of the day is still going to come out strong for Adams, regardless of what you hear on, other media and stuff indicating that this is going to be a close race, and, the various protests that have been going on in New York City over the mandates, that's going to swing the election. I don't think so. Just numerically, I don't think it's possible, but certainly we could see a race where Curtis Sliwa gets in the mid-30s perhaps. It's not something I'm going to be watching that close come election night, but I thought I would make just a brief video kind of surmising this race because it doesn't really get any attention. Everyone talks about New Jersey or Virginia, but, New York City is a big deal. It's the biggest city in the entire country. It has more people than the state of New Jersey, where it's about the same, around 8 million people. So I just thought I would cover this briefly. My final verdict, though, I think this is a safe Democratic race. I think Eric Adams is going to win by a safe margin, probably by over 20 points, probably over 30 points, for being honest. Maybe even more, but I think I'm being charitable to Sliwa because I think he does have grassroots support among people that aren't traditional Republicans that, appreciate the charity work he's done over the past 40 years and would be willing to vote for him. And again, he's not a national Republican. He's not, running ads against abortion or anything like that like we're seeing in Virginia. Very, very different environment because New York City is like a Democrat plus, 50, 40, something like that, city. So you're really seeing a totally different tone from, Republicans at large. So it really remains to be seen what the exact margin is. Again, we'll probably take a look at it on election night. I do plan to probably do a live stream on election night, so be sure to check that out. I'll be putting reminders at the end of all these videos because I definitely want to cover the gubernatorial races that we're having next month in basically 10 days. It's really going to be here before you know it. So anyway, guys, thank you all for watching this video. Please leave a thumbs up if you enjoyed, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell notification so you don't miss any more videos I put out. And again, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.